The white walls of Shangri-La glow amber in the Hawaiian twilight, catching the last rays of sun as they sink behind Diamond Head. Beyond the estate's fortified perimeter, the Pacific Ocean whispers against volcanic rock. Inside these walls lies one of the most extraordinary collections of Islamic art ever assembled. Tile work from Isfahan, carved cedar wood from Damascus, a 13th century prayer niche worth millions. Paradise by any measure, a sanctuary built for beauty. But on the night of October 27th, 1993, the paradise sits empty. 4,000 miles away, in a bedroom in Beverly Hills that has been converted into an intensive care unit, Doris Duke lies skeletal beneath Egyptian cotton sheets. At 80 years old, the woman once called the richest girl in the world weighs barely 90 pounds. An IV line feeds morphine into her veins, 5 milligrams per hour at 4 o'clock. By 6:30, it's doubled. By 7:30, tripled. By 4 in this morning, 25 milligrams flow through her system every hour. Standing nearby, watching the monitors, is Bernard Lafferty, her butler, her gatekeeper, her sole companion. The Irish immigrant who controls every phone call, every visitor, every decision. The man who stands to inherit $5 million the moment her heart stops beating. Was this mercy, or was this murder? Behind these walls, a $1,200 million fortune hangs in the balance. And somewhere in the morphine-soaked hours of that final night, a question takes shape that investigators will spend years trying to answer. How did a palace built for beauty become a gilded cage? To understand how paradise became prison, we must go back to where it all began. Chapter 1. The Richest Girl in the World. On November 22, 1912, a baby girl was born into unimaginable wealth. Her father, James Buchanan Duke, had built an empire on tobacco and electricity. The morning after his daughter's birth, the New York Times ran a front-page headline that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The richest girl in the world, the million-dollar baby. They christened her Doris, but the world knew her as something else entirely. A curiosity, a prize, a walking bank vault. Her father, known as Buck to those close enough to use the name, had transformed North Carolina tobacco farms into a $300 million dynasty. Doris grew up in a gilded prison. Everywhere she went, eyes followed. Reporters tracked her movements. Photographers lurked outside school. Strangers approached with schemes and propositions and desperate pleas. She learned early that most people didn't see her face when they looked at her. They saw dollar signs. The central tragedy of her young life arrived on October 10, 1925. Doris was 12 years old when her father, weakened by pneumonia and years of chronic illness, called her to his deathbed. What he told her in those final moments would shape every decision she made for the next 68 years. Trust no one. A dying man's warning to his only child. And then, he was gone. Buck Duke left. Behind an estate valued at approximately $100 million, a staggering sum in 1925, worth well over $1 billion in today's currency. The estate was split primarily between Doris, her mother, N.A. Naleen, and the Duke University endowment. Doris's share would eventually amount to roughly $80 million, making the 12-year-old one of the wealthiest people in America. The inheritance came in installments, parceled out to protect the young heiress from fortune hunters and her own inexperience. But no amount of careful estate planning could protect her from loneliness. She attended the prestigious Brearley School in New York City, surrounded by the daughters of other wealthy families, yet profoundly isolated. Her classmates knew what she was worth. So did their parents. Every friendship carried the shadow of ulterior motive. Every invitation prompted the question, do they want me or do they want my money? By the time she turned 21 on November 22, 1933, the press descended on the family home like locusts. They wanted photographs, statements, confirmation that the fortune was now officially under her control. The crowds outside East 78th Street grew so thick, so aggressive, that Doris fled to Duke Farms in New Jersey with her mother, Nanaleen, and her half-brother, Walker Inman, for a quiet birthday dinner. The scrutiny was suffocating, the expectations unbearable, and her father's warning echoed in every interaction. Then, in February 1935, at 22 years old, Doris made a decision that seemed like escape. She married James Cromwell, He was 37, 15 years her senior, a man of the world. Cromwell moved through high society with practiced ease. He was handsome, worldly, politically ambitious. He'd been married before, had a young daughter, carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd seen more of life than the sheltered tobacco heiress. To Doris, he must have seemed like freedom itself. More importantly, he proposed something that spoke directly to her trapped heart: a honeymoon. Not 2 weeks in Paris or a month on the Riviera, but a real journey, 10 months circling the globe, far from reporters and society columns and the suffocating weight of being the million-dollar baby. She said yes. In early 1935, the newlyweds departed on what would become one of the most consequential journeys of the 20th century. They would travel by ship and train, by car, and even by camel. They would see temples and palaces, mosques and monuments, civilizations that stretched back thousands of years. Doris Duke was finally escaping the prison of her American life. She had no way of knowing that this journey wouldn't free her. It would simply introduce her to a different kind of cage, one she would spend the next 55 years building with her own hands, one whose beauty would ultimately complicate her final years in ways she could never have imagined. Chapter 2. The Journey That Built a Dream. The honeymoon began in the ancient lands where empires rose and fell on shifting desert sands. Doris and James Cromwell departed America in early 1935, their trunks packed for 10 months abroad, their route tracing the edges of the Islamic world. They moved through Palestine and Jordan, where Crusader castles stood sentinel over biblical landscapes. They wandered the dusty streets of Cairo, where minarets pierced the sky and the call to prayer echoed 5 times daily. But it was India that changed everything. They arrived in the subcontinent in late winter, planning to spend perhaps a few weeks touring the major cities. Instead, they stayed for 2 months, traveling through the north, transfixed by what they found. This wasn't the buttoned-up world of Newport society or Manhattan dinner parties. This was something else entirely. And then they saw the Taj Mahal. It rose from the banks of the Yamuna River like something conjured from dreams, white marble inlaid with semi-precious stones, perfectly symmetrical, catching light differently with each passing hour. Built by Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan in the 17th century as a monument to his beloved wife Mumtaz Mahal, it represented everything Doris had been searching for without knowing she was searching: beauty as purpose, art as devotion, architecture as frozen poetry. Her husband later wrote that Doris has fallen in love with the Taj Mahal and all of the beautiful marble tile with their lovely floral designs and precious stones. It was more than infatuation. It was awakening. She stood before the marble screens. Jali work, they called it. Perforated stone carved into geometric patterns that filtered light into lace-like shadows. She studied the Spiyai Tra Dora technique, where craftsmen had inlaid carnelian and lapis lazuli into white marble, creating flowers and vines. That seemed to grow from the stone itself. She walked through the Red Fort in Delhi, running her fingers along walls where similar techniques had transformed military architecture into art. For the first time in her life, Doris Duke felt something beyond the weight of her inheritance. She felt possibility. Before leaving India, she made her first major decision as a collector, though she didn't yet know that's what she was becoming. In Delhi, she sought out Francis Blomfield, a noted British architect, whose firm specialized in preserving and recreating Mughal architectural elements. She commissioned him to design an entire suite, bedroom and bathroom, inspired by what she'd seen at the Taj Mahal and the Red Fort. The specifications were exacting: marble panels with inlaid stonework, jolly screens, carved details that echoed the great monuments of the Mughal dynasty. The work would be executed by the Indian Marble Works in Agra, craftsmen whose families had been working in these traditions for generations. It would take months to complete. The plan was to have everything shipped to El Mira Soul, the Cromwell family mansion in Palm Beach, where Doris and James would settle into married life among Florida's wealthy elite. But fate, and the Pacific Ocean, had other plans. The Cromwells continued their journey eastward. They traveled through Indonesia, where Hindu and Islamic traditions blended in temple architecture. On August 29th, they sailed into Honolulu Harbor. The plan was simple: 2 weeks in Hawaii, a brief stop to break up the long journey back to the mainland, then home to Palm Beach and the life waiting for them there. Doris stepped off the ship into something she'd never experienced: freedom without scrutiny. Hawaii in 1935 was a territory, not yet a state, a place where the rigid social hierarchies of the mainland seemed to matter less. The air itself felt different, warm, salt-tinged, carrying the scent of plumeria and ginger. The landscape was volcanic drama softened by tropical abundance. And the culture, a blend of native Hawaiian, Asian immigrant, and American influences, operated by different rules than the ones Doris had spent her life trying to escape. More importantly, nobody particularly cared who she was. The Cromwells rented a cottage on Black Point Road, not far from Waikiki, and quickly fell into the company of a remarkable family, the Kahana Moikus. They were Hawaiian royalty of a different sort. With them, Doris learned to surf. She joined them in outrigger canoe races, paddling alongside Sarge and Sam and Bill across waters where ancient Hawaiians had navigated by stars. She attended beach picnics where guitars appeared and voices blended in Hawaiian songs that predated American annexation. 2 weeks became 4. 4 became 8. It was Sam Kahanamoku who showed her the property. He'd heard she was looking, heard that perhaps she might want to stay longer, might want something more permanent than a rented cottage. The plot was 4.9 acres on the Kahala coast, oceanfront land east of Diamond Head, owned by a man named Ernest Woodhouse, who was willing to sell. Sam drove her out to see it. The site was raw, craggy, wind-blasted volcanic rock dropping toward a shoreline where waves broke in endless rhythm. Diamond Head rose to the west, a perfect volcanic profile. To the east, the coastline curved toward Coco Head and eventually Makapuu Point. Dense vegetation could provide privacy. The ocean stretched to the horizon, unobstructed by anything except possibility. Doris stood on that rocky promontory and made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She wouldn't build in Palm Beach. She wouldn't return to the suffocating social obligations of the mainland, the endless scrutiny, the feeling that every room she entered was filled with people calculating her net worth. She wouldn't install the Mughal marble suite in her husband's family mansion, living under his mother's watchful eye. She would build here, in Hawaii, her own house, on her own terms. In April 1936, she purchased the land from Ernest Woodhouse. The price was $100,000, substantial but meaningless against the scale of her fortune. What mattered wasn't the cost. What mattered was the possibility. Sam Kahanamoku received a 5% finder's fee. Her husband James, according to later accounts, vowed he wouldn't pay another penny of Doris's money for the project, already sensing perhaps that this Hawaiian dream was pulling his young wife away from the life he'd imagined for them. But the vision was forming, crystallizing with the clarity of light through marble screens. She would build a modern house, clean lines, simple structure, a blank canvas. And on that canvas, she would layer the art and architecture of the Islamic world. The Mughal marble from India, elements from Morocco, from Persia, from Syria and Egypt, and anywhere else beauty had been carved into stone, or woven into textiles, or fired into ceramic. She didn't know yet how the story would end. She only knew that, for the first time since her father died, she felt something like hope. Chapter 3, Building Paradise. With land secured and vision crystallizing, Doris Duke needed an architect who could translate dreams into structure. She chose Marion Sims Wyeth, a decision that revealed how clearly she understood what she wanted, and more importantly, what she didn't want. Wyeth was what they called a society architect. Born in New York, trained at Princeton and the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, he'd established his practice in Palm Beach, where he designed homes for the wealthy in whatever style they desired. Colonial revival one month, Mediterranean revival the next, modernist when the mood struck. Critics would later dismiss him for lacking a signature style, for being too willing to bend to clients' wishes. But that's exactly why Doris hired him. She didn't want an architect who would impose his vision on her project. She wanted someone who would listen, adapt, and ultimately step aside. Just as important was Wyeth's supervising architect, Drew Baker. While Wyeth worked from his Palm Beach office, Baker would be on site in Honolulu throughout construction. What emerged was essentially modernist architecture at its most spare: clean lines, flat roofs, white stucco walls, minimal ornamentation. It was, quite deliberately, a blank canvas. The design philosophy was radical in its simplicity. Let the structure be neutral and let Islamic art provide the beauty. The walls would be plain white so that tile work could explode in color against them. The interiors would be open and flexible so that carved wood screens could define and redefine spaces. The architecture would serve the collection, not compete with it. Construction began in earnest in 1936, with over 200 workers eventually employed on the site. The basic structure rose quickly, 14,000 square feet for the main house, plus a separate structure called the Playhouse that would serve as guest quarters. But this was only the skeleton. The real work, the transformation from modern architecture into Islamic-inspired paradise, required Doris to travel. In May 1937, with construction underway, the Cromwells departed on a 2-month trip to Europe, including one crucial week in Morocco. If India had been Doris's awakening to Mughal architecture, Morocco became her introduction to North African Islamic traditions. White facades, intricate tile work, carved plaster, rooftop pavilions, courtyard gardens hidden behind fortress-like walls. In Rahbat, they found Rune Martin Workshop. Martin ran one of the most respected traditional craft workshops in Morocco, employing master craftsmen, mahallams, whose families had been working in these techniques for generations. The workshop could produce everything from carved cedar ceilings to Zeelige tile work to colored glass windows set in plaster screens. Doris and James commissioned extensively. They ordered 2 large carved cedar ceilings, one for the foyer, one for the living room. They commissioned massive wooden doors carved in traditional Moroccan patterns. They ordered plaster friezes, archways, colored glass windows. They requested an enormous wooden screen, a mashrabaya, that would shield the central courtyard from the foyer, allowing glimpses without full exposure. Martin's craftsmen worked through the following year, carving and assembling, creating new pieces based on traditional designs. Photographs from the workshop show ma'alams posed with their work, older. Men with decades of experience, younger apprentices learning techniques passed down through families. Their names, tragically, were never recorded. The Moroccan commission would define the sensory experience of entering Shangri-La, the carved ceiling overhead, the colored light filtering through glass, the geometric screen promising beauty beyond. But it was only one layer of what Doris was building. By late 1937, she was planning another trip, this time a 6-week tour of the Middle East, with Iran as the primary focus. This wouldn't be a honeymoon's leisurely wandering. This would be research, documentation, and acquisition on a scale that transformed Doris from enthusiastic collector into serious patron. She and James departed in March 1938, bringing along Mary Crane, a graduate student at NYU's Institute of Fine Arts who'd worked on architectural surveys in Iran. Crane would prove invaluable, helping Doris understand what she was seeing, connecting her with dealers and craftsmen, negotiating purchases. Their destination was Isfahan, the jewel of Safavid Persia, where 17th century Shahbaz I had built a capital city, designed to showcase Islamic architecture at its most glorious. The centerpiece was the Shah Mosque, fronting the great public square, the Maidan. Doris and James spent days there, photographing every detail, filming the facade and interior, studying how light moved across tile work, how geometric patterns interlocked, how calligraphy and floral motifs combined into compositions of breathtaking complexity. Through contacts arranged before the trip, they met EU Bravo, an art dealer based in Tehran with connections to Isfahan's traditional tile workshops. Doris commissioned what would become the largest single artistic element at Shangri-La, a massive tile mosaic for the main courtyard, patterned after the Shah Mosque entrance. Bravo assembled a workshop of tile makers in Isfahan. Photographs he later sent to Doris show the full scope of the operations. They also produced tile work for the playhouse exterior, for archways, for decorative panels throughout the property. The Isfahan tile makers were creating new work using centuries-old techniques. While in Isfahan, Doris and Mary Crane also studied another monument, the Chehel Sotun, a royal pavilion built in 1647. It stood at the edge of a reflecting pool, supported by tall wooden columns, with a covered portico providing shade while opening completely to the outdoors. They photographed it extensively, measured proportions, studied how the columns multiplied in reflection. This would become the model for Shangri-La's Playhouse. Back in Honolulu, Drew Baker received Doris's photographs, measurements, and instructions, transformed the blank structure planned for the guest house into something inspired by the Chehel Sotun, columns, covered portico, a relationship with water. But adapt it, make it work for Hawaii, for modern use, for a 75-foot swimming pool instead of a reflecting pond. Throughout 1938 and into 1939, shipping crates arrived at Honolulu Harbor, carved cedar from Morocco, marble screens from India, tiles from Isfahan. Each arrival brought new challenges for Baker. The Moroccan ceiling didn't quite fit the foyer as originally planned. Adjustments, modifications. The marble jolly screens commissioned in India arrived broken. Disaster turned opportunity. Instead of discarding the shattered pieces, Baker designed a rooftop pavilion specifically to incorporate the broken screens, cutting them down, reinforcing them, creating an airy outdoor space from what might have been thousands of dollars of waste. This was the reality of Shangri-La's construction. Constant problem solving, creative adaptation. Drew Baker working closely with Doris to integrate her vision with the practical requirements of building in Hawaii's climate and with materials shipped from around the world. In 1940, Doris made perhaps her single most significant acquisition. Through negotiations with dealer Hagop Kevorkean, she purchased a 13th century mihrab, a prayer niche, from Verahmin, Iran. Standing nearly 13 feet tall, signed by master artist Ali ibn Muhammad ibn Abi Tahir, and dated 1265 AD, it was one of only 6 surviving mihrabs from the peak of Persian luster production. Kevorkian initially entertained offers from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, but Doris's determination and Mary Crane's persistent negotiation won out. The mihrab would become Shangri-La's spiritual and aesthetic anchor, placed in the prominent arched doorway connecting the living room to what would be called the mihrab room. On Christmas Day, 1938, Doris and James moved into Shangri-La. It wasn't finished. Construction would continue for months, with Drew Baker still on site solving problems, adjusting details, implementing Doris's evolving ideas. But enough was complete to occupy, to begin living with the art, to see how light moved through spaces at different times of day. The total cost was approximately $1.4 million, making it the most expensive private residence ever constructed in Hawaii to that point. But the expense wasn't about displaying wealth. Every dollar served the vision. The name came last. Initially, Doris had called it Hale Kapu, Forbidden House in Hawaiian, but by June 1938, references in correspondence show they had renamed it Shangri-La, after the mythical hidden valley in the enormously popular 1937 film Lost Horizon. For Doris Duke, standing in her unfinished paradise as the world tilted toward World War II, the name must have felt like prophecy. She had built her Shangri-La, a place where beauty lived, where privacy reigned, where she controlled who entered and who remained outside the walls. She couldn't know how the decades ahead would unfold, or how the sanctuary she'd created would shape the final chapters of her life. Chapter 4, Paradise Found. Johnny Gomes met Doris Duke the first day she arrived in Hawaii in 1935. He was still living at Shangri-La when she died in 1993. When asked about the estate during those nearly 60 years, he said something that captured the essential truth of Doris's relationship with her paradise. There was no such word as finished. Shangri-La was never complete because Doris was never complete. The house became an extension of her restless imagination, her evolving taste, her endless pursuit of beauty. Where other collectors acquired and displayed, Doris acquired and integrated, constantly rearranging, reconsidering, tearing out, and rebuilding. The house was alive because she kept it alive. In the early years, life at Shangri-La bore little resemblance to what it would eventually become. She spent her days with the Kahanamoku Ohana, the family who'd first shown her what Hawaii could be. With Sam and Sarge and their wives, she paddled outrigger canoes across waters that had carried Hawaiian voyagers for centuries. She surfed at breaks where Duke Kahanamoku had first demonstrated to the world what riding waves could be. She attended beach picnics at Makapu Peninsula, at Mahkua on the west side, places where guitars appeared naturally and voices blended in Hawaiian harmonies that predated everything America had brought to the islands. In photographs from this period, she looks genuinely happy. Not the posed society smile of her debutante years, but something unguarded. Sand in her hair, casual clothes, surrounded by people who valued her for reasons that had nothing to do with her bank account. The contrast with her mainland life couldn't have been sharper. In New York, she was always the million-dollar baby, always watched, always judged. In Hawaii, behind Shangri-La's walls, she was simply Lai Lai Lei, the name the Kahanamoku family gave her, meaning delicate or fragile. They saw something in her that the society pages never captured. But paradise couldn't protect her from everything. Her marriage to James Cromwell deteriorated steadily. He had political ambitions. He'd served briefly as U.S. ambassador to Canada. That required exactly the kind of public life Doris had fled to Hawaii to escape. He wanted a traditional wife who would host dinners and attend functions and smile for cameras. She wanted to surf and collect Islamic art and live on her own terms. In 1943, they divorced. She was 31 years old. The divorce was civilized by the standards of wealthy Americans, meaning expensive lawyers handled everything, and the public statements were carefully worded. But it confirmed something Doris had perhaps known since her father's deathbed. Relationships were transactions, and eventually everyone wanted something. She kept Shangri-La. That was never in question. It was hers, her land, her vision, her refuge, and she kept building. Throughout the 1940s and 50s, shipping crates continued arriving from dealers in Cairo, Damascus, Tehran, Istanbul. Each acquisition prompted questions. Where does this belong? What needs to move? What needs to change? The living room underwent multiple transformations. Spanish tiles were installed vertically above the fireplace, then removed and reinstalled horizontally. When she acquired an antique Spanish mantel, furniture arrangements shifted with each new textile acquisition. The Chinese Guan Yin sculpture that originally occupied the arch space where the great mihrab now stands was eventually sent to Duke Farms in New Jersey. In the 1960s, Doris turned her attention to the dining room. Originally, it had featured a marine motif, appropriate for an oceanfront property. Glass fishing floats hung from nets. Built-in saltwater aquariums lined the walls. Coral and shells decorated surfaces. Furniture carried sea motifs. She ripped it all out. What replaced it was something entirely different, a tented interior that transformed the room into an Arabian Nights fantasy. Egyptian and Indian textile appliques hung on the walls, their colors blazing against white plaster. She installed an enormous Baccara crystal chandelier from the 1840s, made specifically for export to the Middle East, its prismatic light scattering across surfaces. An Indian bed was converted into a dining table, and on the east wall, one of the massive Isfahan tile mosaics commissioned in 1938 finally found its permanent home. The effect was theatrical, sumptuous, completely divorced from the ocean view just beyond the windows. She had created a space that could exist anywhere. Hawaii disappeared inside the tent. This fascination with tented interiors had deep roots for Doris. She'd commissioned an actual tent from dealers in Damascus years earlier. The playhouse had originally featured a tented ceiling design. Tent panels and appliques kept appearing in her acquisitions. There was something about the temporary made permanent, the nomadic made architectural, that spoke to her. Perhaps because she'd spent her life moving between residences, New York, New Jersey, Newport, Hawaii, later Beverly Hills. Never quite settling, always temporary even in houses she owned. The tent was honest about its impermanence in a way mansions never could be. But in 1965, at the age of 52, Doris made a decision that suggested she was thinking about permanence in a new way. She added a codicil to her will, establishing what would eventually become the Doris Duke Foundation for Islamic Art. The language was clear. Shangri-La would be maintained after her death for the study and understanding of Islamic art and culture. It was a remarkable vision. Decades before her death, she was already imagining Shangri-La as something beyond a private residence. An educational center, a place where scholars could study the collection, where people could learn about Islamic arts and cultures, where beauty could serve a purpose larger than her own enjoyment. Her friend Emma Veary, the beloved Hawaiian singer, witnessed the codicil. Doris trusted Emma with this glimpse into her plans for the future, a future where Shangri-La would outlive her. where the walls would finally open to let the world inside. But opening to the world after death meant continuing to perfect it while alive. The 1980s brought the most ambitious renovation Shangri-La would ever see: the Syrian Room. Doris was in her 70s now, but her acquisitive energy hadn't diminished. She'd purchased elements from a 19th century Damascus Kahaha reception room, from an aristocratic Syrian home, through Hagop Kevorkian's collection at NYU. The components were spectacular: carved and painted ahyame woodwork with metal leaf embellishments, inlaid stone blocks, marble floor tiles, painted ceilings, doors, niches. But they came from a room with different proportions, different ceiling heights, different spatial logic than anything at Shangri-La. No matter, Doris would make it fit. She ordered the removal of the billiards room, a bathroom, and an office. Workers lowered the floor and raised the ceiling. The goal was to recreate, as closely as possible, the experience of being in an actual Damascus reception room from the 1800s. The result was museum quality, a period room that transported visitors to another time and place. The Ajami ceiling glowed with painted patterns and gilding. The marble fountain, Mahsab, sat exactly where it would have in Damascus. The raised seating area, Tazar, invited you to recline on cushions as Syrian aristocrats once had. But here's what was telling: Doris rarely used it. The Syrian room was designed for display, not living. It faced the central courtyard as Damascus rooms traditionally did, but it deliberately isolated itself from the ocean views that characterized the rest of Shangri-La. You entered it and left Hawaii behind completely. It was historically accurate in a way that made it fundamentally different from every other space in the house. She was increasingly a curator, preparing an exhibition, a preservationist safeguarding artifacts, a benefactor building an institution. She still lived at Shangri-La, still entertained occasionally in the tented dining room, still swam in the playhouse pool, but more and more, she moved through the spaces as a guardian rather than an inhabitant. Friends noticed the change. The house felt less like a home and more like a shrine. The focus on perfection, on period accuracy, on museum-quality presentation, it served the future institution she'd written into her will, but it made the present lonelier. By the 1980s, many of the Hawaiian friends from those early joyous years were gone. The Kahanamoku brothers had passed away. The surf sessions and beach picnics belonged to a different era, a different Doris. She was still one of the wealthiest women in the world. Her fortune had grown to well over $1 billion. She still traveled, still acquired art, still renovated and reimagined spaces at Shangri-La. But the walls that had once protected her paradise were beginning to feel confining. And the person she would eventually trust to manage those final years, the person whose presence would transform those walls from protection into prison, was about to enter her life. His name was Bernard Lafferty, and he was waiting in the wings. Chapter 5, The Daughter Who Wasn't. Loneliness was the one thing Doris Duke's fortune could never fix. 2 marriages had ended in divorce. First James Cromwell in 1943, then tobacco heir Porfirio Rubirosa in 1948 after just 1 year. In 1940, she'd given birth to a daughter who lived less than 24 hours, a tragedy she rarely spoke about but never forgot. Her mother, Nanaline, died in 1962. Her half-brother, Walker Inman Jr., struggled with his own demons before his death in 1991. The Kahanamoku brothers, who'd given her such joy in those early Hawaiian years, were gone by the 1980s. At 72 years old, Doris Duke had $1 billion fortune, 4 palatial residences, one of the world's finest collections of Islamic art, and almost no one who loved her for reasons that had nothing to do with what she was worth. Then, in 1984, she met Chandi Hefner. It happened in Hawaii, appropriately, the one place where Doris had always felt something close to freedom. Hefner was 32 years old, roughly half Doris's age, a follower of Hare Krishna, who'd rejected her middle-class Baltimore upbringing for communal farm living. They were introduced through mutual friends, and something clicked immediately. They shared a passion for dance. Doris had studied dance religiously throughout her life, taking lessons well into her 60s. Hefner was trained in classical Indian dance forms. They could talk for hours about movement. They shared an interest in Eastern philosophy. While Doris had approached Islamic art as an aesthetic pursuit rather than a religious one, she'd always been drawn to non-Western ways of understanding the world. Hefner's immersion in Krishna consciousness, her vegetarianism, her meditation practice. These weren't exotic to Doris. They were intriguing, and they shared a love of animals. Doris kept camels at Duke Farms. She'd funded wildlife protection causes for years. Hefner's commitment to animal welfare and her obvious genuine affection for creatures great and small touched something in the older woman. But more than any shared interest, Hefner offered something Doris had been missing for decades: uncomplicated companionship, or so it seemed. Peggy Lee, the legendary singer and Doris's longtime friend, later said she always wanted a daughter. Chandi filled an empty spot in Miss Duke's life. In 1985, Hefner moved into Duke Farms in New Jersey, the 2,700-acre estate where Doris had fled on her 21st birthday to escape the crowds. Having Hefner there made the massive property feel less empty. In 1986, Doris purchased a $1.5 million horse ranch for Hefner in Oahu, not far from Shangri-La. The gesture was extravagant, but not unusual for Doris. She'd always been generous with people she cared about, funding projects and causes that mattered to them. They traveled together, Europe, Asia, destinations that combined Doris's collecting interests with their shared cultural curiosities. Doris paid for everything naturally. She'd always been the one paying. But with Hefner, it felt different. It felt like having family again. At some point during this period, Hefner introduced Doris to Bernard Lafferty. He was born in County Down, Ireland, orphaned at 17. He'd emigrated to Philadelphia and worked his way up through hotels and theaters, eventually becoming a personal assistant. He'd worked for Peggy Lee. That's how Hefner knew him. He was soft-spoken, deferential, presentable in the way that good domestic staff must be. Doris hired him as a butler. It seemed like a minor decision at the time. By 1987, Hefner's influence over Doris's life was expanding beyond companionship into business affairs. She persuaded Doris to fire her longtime business manager and replace him with Irwin Bloom, a New York accountant. That same year, Doris drafted a new will naming Hefner as executor. The message was clear. Hefner wasn't just a friend anymore. She was being positioned as Doris's heir apparent, the person who would manage the fortune and make decisions about the future. In 1988, Doris made it official. She legally adopted Chandi Hefner as her daughter. At 75 years old, Doris Duke finally had the child she'd lost 48 years earlier. For perhaps the first time in decades, Doris wasn't alone. The illusion lasted about a year. In 1989, Hefner began a romantic relationship with James Burns, one of Doris's bodyguards. The relationship itself wasn't necessarily the problem. Doris had never been prudish about such things. The problem was what it represented: divided loyalty. The moment she sensed that someone's attention was elsewhere, her suspicion grew. Hefner's behavior shifted after the adoption. Staff members noticed it immediately. The woman who'd been friendly and deferential suddenly became imperious, giving orders, acting as if her adopted status conferred authority over the household. Other staff members complained about her bossiness, her presumption, her increasingly difficult personality, and they complained to Doris. By early 1991, Doris's affection had curdled into suspicion. In February 1991, she ordered her lawyer to tell Hefner to leave. They never saw each other again. But the paranoia didn't end with Hefner's departure. It intensified. Doris told staff members that she believed Hefner had poisoned her. Doris ordered tests run on food and sherry at Shangri-La, searching for evidence of toxins. None were found. But the absence of physical evidence did nothing to dispel Doris's conviction. In her mind, the betrayal was complete. Hefner had been manipulating her way into the will, and then, when Doris became inconvenient, trying to speed her death. Whether any of this was true didn't matter. What mattered was that Doris believed it. The psychological impact was devastating. She was 78 years old now, increasingly frail, and more isolated than she'd been in decades. The Hawaiian friends were gone. Her mother was gone. Her half-brother was dying. And the one person she'd tried to make family had, she believed, tried to kill her. Colin Shanley returned to work for Doris in March 1991, a few weeks after the Hefner expulsion. He barely recognized his employer. In 1989, when he'd quit because of Hefner, Doris had been a vibrant older woman who swam laps daily, who moved through Shangri-La, with energy and purpose. Now, the paranoia about poisoning had extended to her eating habits. She was consuming less, withdrawing into herself. The expulsion of Chandi Hefner created a void in Doris Duke's life, a void that needed filling. She needed someone she could rely on. Lafferty had been working as her butler for years by this point. Quiet, deferential, always present, but never intrusive. He knew how she liked her tea. He knew which rooms she preferred at different times of day. He knew her habits, her schedules, her preferences. And crucially, he'd been introduced to her by Hefner. But he'd stayed loyal to Doris when Hefner left. That loyalty, whether real or performed, was exactly what Doris needed to see. In the wake of the Hefner disaster, Lafferty's role began to expand. The void was being filled by someone who understood exactly how to use it. Chapter 6, The Butler's Ascent. When Colin Shanley returned to work in March 1991, he barely recognized his employer. In 1989, when he'd quit because of Chandi Hefner, Doris had been 76 but vital, swimming laps in the playhouse pool every morning, moving through the estate with purpose and energy. The woman he saw now looked skeletal. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor. Her eyes seemed distant, clouded. She was frail, Shanley would later testify. Very frail. But the most dramatic change wasn't Doris's appearance. It was Bernard Lafferty's role. A traditional butler occupies a strange position in wealthy households, simultaneously invisible and essential. They manage the smooth operation of daily life while remaining in the background. That's what Lafferty had been from the mid-1980s until early 1991. After Hefner's expulsion, everything changed. Lafferty wasn't just serving tea anymore. He was deciding who got to sit down to drink it. He wasn't just answering the phone. He was screening every call, deciding which ones reached Doris and which ones didn't. He was giving staff orders, claiming to speak for Miss Duke, positioning himself as the sole conduit to their employer. Ann Bostitch, who worked as Doris's housekeeper in Beverly Hills, later testified, "He made it clear that everyone had to go through him first to speak to Miss Duke about anything." Friends who'd known Doris for decades found themselves unable to reach her. Phone calls went unanswered, messages disappeared. Family members experienced the same barriers. Walker Inman, Doris's half-nephew and closest living relative, found it increasingly difficult to make contact. The isolation was systematic. Each individual restriction seemed reasonable. Miss Duke is tired. Miss Duke doesn't want to be disturbed. Collectively, they amounted to near complete control over her access to the outside world. And as Lafferty's control increased, so did his influence over Doris's legal decisions. Between 1991 and 1992, Doris changed her will 3 times. In the spring of 1991, she named Dr. Harry Demopoulos and Chemical Bank as co-executors. By November, that had changed. Irwin Bloom became executor. By April 1992, another codicil. Lafferty appeared as co-executor alongside Walker Inman. 3 wills in 13 months, each one reducing the circle of trust, each one elevating someone new, and Lafferty was ascending. The spring of 1992 also brought the medical disasters that would begin Doris Duke's final descent. At 79, she decided she wanted a facelift. She sought out Dr. Harry Glassman, a well-known Hollywood plastic surgeon. The procedure itself went smoothly. 2 days later, Doris fell out of bed and broke her hip. At her age, the fracture carried serious mortality risk. She was rushed to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, where emergency surgery repaired the break. Glassman recommended she see Dr. Charles Kivowitz, an internist. This was where professional boundaries began to blur. Throughout the summer of 1992, Glassman and Kivowitz became regular visitors at Doris's Beverly Hills home. They didn't just make house calls, they stayed, they socialized. Staff members observed them arriving in the late afternoon, opening bottles of expensive champagne that Doris provided freely. They'd sit with her for hours, drinking, talking, the relationship evolving from doctor-patient into something that looked more like friendship. Doris grew especially fond of Dr. Glassman. There's a reason medical ethics emphasize maintaining professional boundaries. When doctors become friends, objective clinical judgment becomes difficult. And when a patient is worth over $1 billion, the temptations multiply further. By the fall of 1992, Doris had decided on another surgery, a double knee replacement. Her stated reason was that she wanted to dance again. Dr. Kivowitz advised against it. So did Eleanor Lawson, her longtime dance teacher. The risks were enormous, Doris insisted. Who could tell her no? She'd spent her entire life having her decisions executed without question. The pattern was now established. Doris Duke, increasingly isolated from old friends and family, was surrounding herself with new people who'd entered her life recently. Lafferty controlled access to her. Glassman and Kivowitz provided medical care that had evolved beyond professional. All three stood to benefit from their position in her life. In January 1993, Doris underwent the double knee replacement at Cedars-Sinai. The operation was technically successful, but she returned to recuperate, carried from the plane to the house where she'd once run freely, where she'd swum laps every morning. Now she could barely walk, and the medications that would cloud her final months had begun to flow. Chapter 7. The Prescription Trap. Pain management after major orthopedic surgery requires powerful drugs. Perched, a combination of oxycodone and aspirin, became part of her daily regimen. When that wasn't enough, Demerol, a strong opioid that can cause confusion even at therapeutic doses. But they weren't alone. She was also taking sleeping pills, multiple types, because one wasn't working anymore, antidepressants. She continued drinking wine daily, and she was still taking laxatives, a habit from her younger years that had become increasingly dangerous. The combination was staggering. Each medication interacted with the others in ways that multiplied their effects. The cumulative impact on a 79-year-old woman was severe. Colin Shanley, watching her during those weeks, later testified, she did not know where she was or what day it was. She would wake thinking she was in a different house, in a different decade. She'd ask for people who'd been dead for years. The woman whose mind had been sharp enough to build a billion-dollar art collection, to negotiate with dealers across 3 continents, that woman was disappearing into a fog of prescription medications. Lafferty was there constantly, managing her care, controlling who saw her and when. By late February 1993, the situation had become critical. Doris was severely malnourished and dangerously dehydrated. She was flown emergency back to Los Angeles and admitted to Cedars-Sinai. Hospital records told a concerning story. Nurses noted she was intermittently disoriented and confused. She hallucinated, once insisting she was in a noisy apartment in Brooklyn. On March 2nd, a staff neurologist named Dr. Clark Espy examined her. His report: Doris suffered from mild delirium, possibly exacerbated by prescription drugs. When medications were reduced, nurses noted improvement. She had periods of clarity, windows of lucidity surrounded by clouds of disorientation. It was during one of those windows that the final, legal changes occurred. In early March, while hospitalized, Doris asked Dr. Glassman, the plastic surgeon who'd been socializing with her for months, if he could recommend a lawyer, not calling her longtime attorney, not reaching out to legal firms she'd worked with for decades, asking her plastic surgeon. Glassman connected her with Alan Kroll, a neighbor. Kroll referred her to William Doyle Jr. at Catton, Muchin, and Zavis, a large Chicago firm. Doyle flew from Chicago the next day. Doris wanted to replace Irwin Bloom as executor with Bernard Lafferty. She told Doyle that Bloom had lost his sense of territory, had violated the cardinal sin of somehow thinking that he had become Mr. Duke. Doyle pointed out Lafferty's lack of education. Doris dismissed the concern. She told me that he wasn't college educated, but nor was she. He had been by her side 24 hours a day for 6 years. He was intimately familiar with her view of life. On March 9, 1993, Doris Duke signed the new codicil. She was so weak that William Doyle had to guide her hand as she wrote. Witnesses watched as the lawyer physically helped her form the signature. Doyle later admitted he knew there would be legal challenges. It was clear she was disinheriting her daughter. Any third grader would realize this was going to be a contested estate. But knowing a will would be contested didn't stop him from executing it. Bernard Lafferty was now sole executor. He would receive a $5 million executor's fee upon Doris's death, plus $500,000 annually for the rest of his life. Doris was released from Cedars-Sinai on April 15th. The pattern of confusion continued. In July 1993, she insisted on another knee operation. Dr. Kivowitz advised against it. 2 days after being sent home, She had a massive stroke. She returned to Cedars-Sinai for 2 months. The damage was significant, her mobility severely limited, her cognitive function further impaired. On September 20th, 1993, she was sent home for the final time. Her bedroom at the Beverly Hills house was converted into an intensive care unit, 2 nurses on duty around the clock. A stomach tube provided nutrition. A tracheotomy tube assisted with breathing. This wasn't recovery, this was end-of-life care. And standing in that room, controlling access, managing the nurses, making decisions, was Bernard Lafferty, the man who now controlled every aspect of her existence, the person who stood to inherit millions the moment her heart stopped beating. Shangri-La, the paradise built to be a refuge from the world, stood empty across the Pacific, its tiles gleaming in Hawaiian sunlight. Doris Duke would never see it again. She had 5 weeks left to live. Chapter 8. The Final Days. The bedroom now looked like any hospital room. Medical monitors lined the walls. IV stands clustered around the bed. Doris Duke controlled nothing. She couldn't eat without a tube. She couldn't breathe without assistance. She couldn't move from her bed. On October 7th, 1993, she told Dr. Kivowitz that she didn't want to continue living if her health couldn't improve. The knees that were supposed to let her dance again would never support her weight. At 80 years old, after multiple surgeries and a devastating stroke, there was no path forward. The next day, October 8th, Dr. Kivowitz issued an order. Take no special measures to keep her alive. Heavy sedation began. Medical records show a significant increase in pain medications and sedatives. The stated reason was comfort. But the medications did more than provide comfort. They clouded consciousness, suppressed breathing, made communication difficult or impossible. While Doris lay dying, Lafferty was spending her money. In October 1993 alone, he charged $20,000 to Doris's credit cards, mostly on clothing for himself. Large gifts were also being distributed, allegedly authorized by Doris through Lafferty. Dr. Glassman received $500,000. Dr. Kivowitz received $10,000 in addition to his regular medical fees, both gifts authorized by a woman who was heavily sedated, barely conscious, and, according to multiple witnesses, incapable of making coherent decisions. On October 26th, Dr. Kivowitz made another decision: stop the feeding tube and discontinue supplemental oxygen. Without nutrition, the body begins to shut down. Without extra oxygen, breathing becomes more labored. These were the final steps before death. October 27th, 1993, began with visitors. That morning, Dr. Kivowitz arrived at the Beverly Hills house, along with Dr. Glassman and William Doyle, the Chicago lawyer who'd guided Doris's hand to sign the March codicil. 3 men who'd entered her life recently, all of whom had financial interests in her estate, all gathering on what would turn out to be her final day. In the afternoon, a package arrived, medication from the pharmacy. Colin Shanley, still working as cook, accepted the delivery in the kitchen. Before he could bring it to the nursing staff, Lafferty grabbed it from his hands. At 4 p.m., Dr. Kivowitz ordered a morphine drip. Starting dose, 5 milligrams per hour. The order specified that nurses could increase the flow by 1 milligram per hour as needed for pain management. This is standard protocol for terminal patients. You start with a baseline dose and adjust based on the patient's symptoms. Except, that's not what happened. At 6:30 p.m., 2.5 hours after the drip started, the dosage jumped to 10 milligrams per hour, not a 1 milligram increase, double the starting dose. At 7:30 p.m., another increase, 15 milligrams per hour. Before leaving for the night, Dr. Kivowitz personally administered an additional 10 milligram injection. By 4 a.m. on October 28th, the morphine drip had reached 25 milligrams per hour, 5 times the starting dose. Nurses' notes described Doris's breathing slowing dramatically. Fluid was accumulating in her lungs. Her respiratory system was failing. At 5:15 a.m., the nurses administered another injection, this time 100 milligrams of Demerol. The nurses' notes indicate that Dr. Glassman ordered the Demerol by telephone, at Dr. Kivowitz's request. Glassman, the plastic surgeon, ordering pain medication in the middle of the night for a patient dying under another doctor's care. Kivowitz, who wasn't present, requesting additional narcotics be given to a patient already receiving extremely high doses of morphine. At 5:48 a.m. on October 28, 1993, Doris Duke stopped breathing. Lafferty was at her bedside. So was William Doyle, the two men who stood to profit most from her death. One as executor, one as representative of the law firm that had already billed the estate over $13 million, were the witnesses to her final moment. Within hours, Dr. Joshua Trabulus, Dr. Kievowitz's partner, who had not been treating Doris and had not witnessed her death, signed the death certificate, cause of death, fluid in the lungs, and acute infection. Before the day ended, Lafferty and Doyle made another decision: immediate cremation. Doris Duke's body was taken to Westwood Mortuary and cremated within hours of her death. No autopsy. No examination by an independent medical examiner. No opportunity for anyone to question the circumstances or test for drug levels. The evidence, if there had been evidence, was now ash. Chapter 9, The Investigation. The questions began almost immediately. Nurses who'd worked in that converted bedroom talked to colleagues. Former doctors who'd treated Doris for years heard about the circumstances and raised concerns. Staff members who'd witnessed Lafferty's transformation from butler to gatekeeper came forward. By early 1994, the Los Angeles District Attorney had launched a formal investigation into possible elder abuse and suspicious death. On March 9th, the document that made Lafferty sole executor. Hospital records showed she suffered from mild drug-induced delirium. 3 separate doctors submitted affidavits concluding that Duke's documented drug combination would have significantly interfered with her thinking. The financial motives were impossible to ignore. Lafferty stood to receive a substantial executor's fee. The law firm had already billed the estate $13.5 million. Dr. Glassman had received $500,000. But suspicion isn't proof. The legal battle shifted to surrogate's court in Manhattan. Chandi Hefner filed 3 separate lawsuits claiming she was the rightful heir. Former advisors claimed the will was invalid due to Duke's impaired mental state. The proceedings dragged on for nearly 2 years. In April 1995, Hefner reached a settlement: $65 million. Part of the agreement included a strict silence clause. Hefner agreed never to discuss publicly her relationship with Doris Duke or the reasons for her expulsion. Whatever she knew about those final years was sealed. The ultimate ruling came later in 1995. Bernard Lafferty was removed as executor. But removal as executor wasn't criminal prosecution. Despite the investigation, despite the suspicious circumstances, despite medical experts questioning the drug administration, no criminal charges were ever filed against Lafferty, Kivowitz, Glassman, or anyone else involved in Doris Duke's final days. The reason was simple and devastating: insufficient evidence. The cremation had destroyed any physical evidence. No autopsy had been performed, no tissue samples preserved. Everything that could have definitively proved or disproved the allegations, drug levels in tissues, evidence of organ damage, had been destroyed in the cremation fire. Without physical evidence, prosecutors had only circumstantial cases built on suspicious timing, questionable dosages, and financial motives. The Los Angeles District Attorney quietly closed the investigation in 1996. No charges filed, no trial, no determination of guilt or innocence. Lafferty received a reduced settlement, nothing close to the original executor's fee, but still substantial. He died in 1996, just 3 years after Doris. The official cause was acute peritonitis. Dr. Kivowitz continued practicing medicine. Dr. Glassman continued performing cosmetic surgeries. William Doyle continued representing wealthy estates. None of them ever admitted wrongdoing. None ever faced criminal consequences. The truth had been cremated along with the evidence. Chapter 10. Paradise Lost. In 1965, at the age of 52, Doris Duke had written a codicil to her will with a single clear instruction: Shangri would be maintained after her death for the study and understanding of Islamic art and culture. It took decades, a bitter legal battle, and the resolution of a possible murder investigation before that instruction could be fulfilled. But in the end, the palace she built survived everything that followed. The Doris Duke Foundation for Islamic Art was formally established in 1998. The years that followed were dedicated to preparing Shangri-La for public access. a task that required extraordinary care. By 1999, archivists began cataloging the collection. Over 3,500 individual objects, spanning centuries and civilizations, assembled by one woman over the course of 55 years. The work was painstaking. Each piece needed to be documented, photographed, its provenance traced, its condition assessed. Moroccan cedar ceilings were cleaned and stabilized. Isfahan tile mosaics were examined for hairline fractures. The 13-foot mihrab, 700 years old, one of only 6 surviving examples from the peak of Persian luster production, received particular attention. Major physical repairs and conservation work continued through 2001. The Hawaiian climate, with its salt air and humidity, had taken its toll on materials never designed for this environment. In November 2002, Shangri-La opened to the public for the first time. Tours operate through the Honolulu Museum of Art, which manages the estate on behalf of the foundation. Visitors arrive by shuttle from downtown Honolulu, passing through security gates that once kept the outside world at bay. They walk paths that Doris Duke walked for decades, through gardens that frame the white walls she chose specifically to serve as a neutral canvas. And then they step inside. The foyer opens, with a carved Moroccan cedar ceiling overhead, the work of Ma'alams, master craftsman in René Martin's Rabat workshop, who carved these patterns in 1937 and 1938. Colored light filters through glass set in plaster screens. The massive mashrabia, the great wooden screen, offers geometric glimpses of the courtyard beyond. Their names were never recorded, but their work has survived nearly a century, and visitors pause beneath it now without knowing anything about the hands that shaped it. The rooms have been preserved exactly as Duke left them. Not reconstructions, not period approximations. The actual spaces she lived in, with the actual objects she acquired, arranged largely as she arranged them. The living room draws the eye immediately to the mihrab, the 13th century Persian prayer niche standing nearly 13 feet tall in its arched doorway. Signed by master artist Ali ibn Muhammad ibn Abu Tahir and dated 1265, it is one of the oldest and most significant objects in the entire collection. The luster-painted surface, ceramic glazed with metallic oxides to produce an iridescent sheen, still catches light the way it has for 7 centuries. Beside it, Spanish tiles line the fireplace surround. Medieval shields and lances hang on the walls. Ceramics fill open niches, their glazes deep and luminous. The tented dining room transforms the space entirely. Egyptian and Indian textile appliques hang from the walls, their colors blazing against white plaster. The enormous baccarat crystal chandelier from the 1840s, made specifically for export to the Middle East, scatters prismatic light across surfaces. On the east wall, one of the massive Isfahan tile mosaics commissioned in 1938 occupies its permanent position. The blues and turquoises remain luminous after nearly a century. The Syrian room stops visitors in their tracks. Carved and painted Ajami woodwork covers every surface, ceiling, walls, niches, decorated with metal leaf that catches the light. The marble fountain sits where it would have, in an aristocratic Damascus reception room from the 19th century. The raised seating area invites you to recline on cushions as Syrian aristocrats once did. Step through the doorway, and Hawaii disappears entirely. This was the room Doris rarely used herself. Designed for display, not living. It was the room that revealed, more than any other, how she'd begun to think of Shangri-La, not as a home, but as an institution she was preparing for the future. Outside, the playhouse awaits. Its red columns, the color Mary Crane determined from studying miniature paintings, a choice vindicated by photographs from Isfahan, rise against the Isfahan tile work that covers the exterior. Inside, the tile fireplace features warriors, feasters, and dancers frozen in ceramic. The 75-foot swimming pool stretches the length of the structure, still filled, the water reflecting the columns and tiles above it. This is where Doris swam laps every morning during the decades when Shangri-La was her paradise, before isolation and illness made such mornings impossible. The rooftop pavilion, built from the broken marble jolly screens that arrived shattered from India, disaster turned into opportunity by Drew Baker's ingenuity, offers a view of Diamond Head and the Pacific. The The screens, reinforced and reassembled, filter the Hawaiian light into geometric shadows, exactly as their makers intended, centuries ago, in a different country, for a different purpose. Throughout the estate, the collection tells a story that spans continents and centuries. Iznik ceramics from 16th century Turkey, Spanish luster tiles from aristocratic collections, textiles from India and Central Asia, carved wood from Damascus and Morocco. Each object was chosen by Doris Duke personally, often after years of searching, often after traveling thousands of miles to see it in context before bringing it home. The result is what scholars call inventive synthesis, not a museum attempting to replicate any single Islamic civilization, but a deeply personal vision assembled from many civilizations at once. Isfahan beside Damascus, Morocco beside Mughal India, Ottoman Turkey beside Safavid Persia. The collection doesn't pretend to be comprehensive or historically rigorous in the way a museum's permanent collection might be. It is something rarer, the testament of one person's lifelong devotion to beauty, translated into stone and tile and wood and ceramic, and preserved for others to experience. The educational mission Duke envisioned in 1965 is now fully realized. The foundation sponsors scholarship and research. Artists participate in residency programs at Shangri. Exhibitions explore the techniques and traditions represented in the collection. Scholars study the mihrab, the Syrian room, the Isfahan tile work, contributing to a deeper understanding of Islamic artistic traditions across centuries. Visitors walk through these rooms without knowing, perhaps, the full weight of what they're seeing. They admire the tile work without knowing about the Isfahan workshops where young apprentices cut each piece by hand. They photograph the mihrab without knowing about the years of negotiation it took to acquire, or the Metropolitan Museum's competing offer that Doris outmaneuvered. They marvel at the Syrian room without knowing that an entire bathroom was demolished to make it fit, and they walk through a palace where a woman spent 55 years pursuing beauty. A woman who inherited a fortune at 12, who traveled the world at 22, who built a paradise at 23, and who spent the rest of her life filling it with the finest Islamic art she could find. The rooms hold no trace of what happened in those final months. The morphine drip was in Beverly Hills. The legal battles were fought in Manhattan. The investigation was conducted in Los Angeles. Shangri-La itself was spared the details of Doris Duke's death. It sat empty across the Pacific while the events unfolded 4,000 miles away. What remains here is what she built. The carved ceilings and geometric screens, the centuries-old prayer niche and the Isfahan tiles, the playhouse with its Persian columns and its swimming pool, the Syrian room with its painted wood and marble fountain, the tented dining room with its chandelier and its textiles, 3,500 objects, 55 years of collecting, one woman's vision preserved exactly as she left it, open now for the world to see. The art endures, and in these white-walled rooms where Hawaiian sunlight filters through screens carved by hands that turned to dust centuries ago, Doris Duke's paradise lives on, not as a prison, not as a crime scene, but as the museum she always intended it to become.